Hello, welcome to this lecture on Chapter 11, entitled Adaptations to Aerobic and Anaerobic Training. For those of you that are interested in the anaerobic training portion, I think you will find this lecture somewhat disappointing. The majority of the chapter focuses on the aerobic adaptations. It's about a 30-page chapter, and your authors, for some reason, devote only about 5 to 6 pages in the textbook to anaerobic training. So I'm going to call it what it actually is, Adaptations to Aerobic Training, with a side helping of anaerobic training. So we'll start off talking about aerobic training, and we need to define cardiorespiratory endurance. And you can see there it's the ability to sustain prolonged dynamic exercise. And in general, this requires repetitive muscle action, usually from larger muscle groups. So the legs, when you're running, cycling, even you can include swimming with an upper body component, but it's basically rhythmic, repeated contractions. And cardiorespiratory endurance is in contrast to muscular endurance, which usually denotes a single muscle or a single muscle group. Now, increases in cardiorespiratory endurance occur through increases in a couple of different systems. The cardiovascular system plays a big part, and most of the chapter is actually devoted to cardiovascular improvements that occur. There is a little bit on respiratory improvement. Actually, I think the authors of your textbook devote a whole slide to it. And then the other component that can increase your cardiorespiratory endurance, you've got muscle changes, increases in muscle strength, and then certain metabolic changes. So one of the questions you might ask is, how do you evaluate cardiorespiratory endurance? Well, cardiorespiratory endurance is best evaluated through a maximal exertion exercise test, or something that we call a VO2 max test. And oxygen consumption, we can put into an equation, something called the Fick equation, that hopefully you recognize from your undergraduate exercise physiology classes. And this is where oxygen uptake is equal to stroke volume times heart rate times the AVO2 difference. And if you look at this, you can break it down into two different components essentially. You've got stroke volume and heart rate, so the ability of the heart to pump blood to the tissues. This is a delivery limitation, or something that could influence or have a great impact on oxygen uptake. And then on the other side, you've got the AVO2 difference, basically the ability of the tissues to take in and utilize the oxygen that has been delivered. And this is called utilization. And there's I don't want to say a big debate, but there's a debate as to what limits VO2 max. Is it the ability of the heart and the blood vessels to deliver oxygenated blood? Or is it the ability of the muscles essentially to take up that oxygenated blood and to use it? We're going to come back to this slide, and one way to increase your cardiorespiratory endurance is through endurance training. And there have been many studies that have been done. People that have been sedentary before, gone through an endurance training program, and then they've looked at their VO2 max, and basically what they've found is that you can increase your endurance capacity or your VO2 max significantly with training. And by all accounts, I mean, it depends what your baseline is, but Depending on the study you'll read, you'll see increases anywhere from about 15 to 20% in VO2 max on an endurance training program. And it kind of makes sense if maximal endurance capacity increases, submaximal endurance capacity also has to increase. And a reflection of that is that you have a lower heart rate in a trained state at the same submaximal intensity as you did compared to when you were untrained. For example, if I've been a couch potato and I decide that I want to start exercising, let's say that I buy a treadmill and I decide to run at 5 miles an hour, and I get a heart rate monitor and I track it. The initial time when I'm in that untrained state, I'll track it and I'll say, maybe my heart rate is 130. If I continue and if I am very good at training, so I say I run at that 5 mile an hour pace every day, in 6 months, if I take a look at my heart rate, what's going to happen is that it's going to be significantly lower after I've trained for 6 months compared to when I was sedentary. So if you look at the very last point on the slide here, basically what it's trying to say is that your level of endurance training has an effect on your performance. And essentially, the better trained you are, the higher percent of your maximal capacity you can perform at. And we'll provide a graph in the next slide to hit home this point. So basically what we have here is somebody that is prior to training. So in sedentary state, this is the blue line, and you can see that their maximal running speed is about 13 kilometers per hour. So I'm going to translate that for you all. It is the equivalent of about 8 miles an hour. And then after 12 months of endurance training, their VO2 has increased from 44 milliliters per kilogram per minute up to about 57. This represents a 30% increase, and their peak running speed has also increased. It's gone up to about 16 kilometers per hour, or right around 10 miles an hour. So they can run quite a bit faster after training. So this slide essentially is a mini table of contents. So we're going to focus specifically on the cardiovascular changes that occur with aerobic training. So we're going to look at issues with regards to the heart and issues with regards to blood vessels and how you can transport blood through the cardiovascular system. Alright, so let's talk again about the Fick equation. You can see the equation up there. And if we want to have an increase in VO2 max, we need to try to increase some of these components. We can increase stroke volume. We can take a look and see what happens to heart rate, and then we can try to increase a VO2 difference. And let me tell you about a student of mine at Southern Arkansas. So this guy, before I knew him, he told me he was overweight. He said he was about 350 pounds. And when I knew him, he would come into the fitness center every day. He would jack up the treadmill grade as high as it would go, and then he would run basically as fast as he could for about an hour. He was dripping with sweat. A lot of people complained, but that was his exercise routine. And when I knew him, he was, I don't know, probably about 190, maybe 185. He had lost a lot of weight. And we did a lab once with him and took his resting heart rate. And his heart rate was in the 30s. It was one of the lowest heart rates I've ever seen. And this is due to the effect of the parasympathetic nervous system. There was increased tone causing a decrease in heart rate. And essentially what you're going to see with exercise training is that heart rate, especially maximal heart rate, is not going to change very much, or in some cases it'll actually decrease to allow a greater filling capacity, greater amount of blood to filter into the heart to be then transported to the tissues. So, if we're looking at this Fick equation and we're trying to describe where adaptations occur, basically we're going to have either an increase in stroke volume or an increase in AVO2 difference. So it gets back to the presentation versus utilization argument that's going on. And I think you're going to see throughout these next couple of slides where your authors fall on. But for the sake of argument, I'll try to present this with the least amount of bias as possible. So your heart is basically like any other muscle that you have. If you train that muscle, it's going to increase in muscle mass. You train your heart by doing cardiorespiratory endurance activities, you're going to see an increase in heart mass. And because the left ventricle is the chamber of the heart that is responsible for pumping blood out to the rest of the body, what you're going to see is an increase in left ventricular volume. So one of the classic changes that occurs with endurance training is that you see an increase in plasma volume. And probably as you listen to this lecture and watch it, we are going to refer to changes in plasma volume and physiological consequences throughout. So just be prepared for this. When we talk about it with regards to what happens in the heart, is that you see an increase in plasma volume, and what happens is there's an increased amount of blood that returns to the heart. And basically your heart acts kind of like a balloon, and it increases the left ventricular volume. So it expands to accept this increasing amount of plasma. Another consequence that happens is that you have a decrease in heart rate, and I've already alluded to this. So because you have that decrease in heart rate, you have greater time to fill up that reservoir with blood. And this results in an increase in end diastolic volume. Because of this, you have a greater volume. When your heart beats, you actually pump out more. So this results in an increase in stroke volume. And this is called a volume loading effect. Now, if you look at the final point on your slide there, I'm not sure why it's included here, but your textbook talks about what happens to the heart with resistance training. So I guess we'll cover it now. With resistance training, essentially what happens is you place stress on the heart in a different manner. It's not the constant beating that you get. You don't really have the changes with plasma volume. What happens is that you place a different kind of stress on the heart. Essentially, you increase the afterload, and this has an effect on total peripheral resistance. So your book talks about blood pressure that can be as high as 480 for a systolic and 350 millimeters of mercury for diastolic. It's a really high amount of pressure. And so this affects, like I said, the afterload. In order to overcome this resistance, what happens is that the actual cardiac wall increases, it hypertrophies, and it becomes thicker due to the increase in blood pressure that you see with resistance training rather than due to the repetitive contractions that you see with endurance training. So because you have this cardiac hypertrophy, an increase in the thickening of the wall muscle, with resistance training, you do see an increase in stroke volume, not so much, like I said before, due to differences in plasma volume, but because the actual heart muscle has a greater muscle mass and it can pump out more. And I think your textbook might have included resistance-trained individuals in this section to kind of set up this particular slide. This figure is reproduced from the Fagard article, which we'll read in class and we'll discuss. But basically they looked at runners and cyclists, which are your endurance-trained athletes, and then they looked at strength athletes, which are your resistance-trained, and they looked at different measures associated with the heart. So the LVID there, it's the left ventricular internal diameter, or it's a measurement of chamber size. And you can see that your endurance athletes have a bigger internal chamber size than the strength athletes. In the middle, you've got MWT, which stands for mean wall thickness. And then on the right-hand side, you've got LVM, which stands for left ventricular mass. And you can see there again that the left ventricular mass is much larger in the endurance athletes compared to the resistance trained. And if we look at the middle, it's not as much difference, especially if you look at the difference between runners and resistance trained athletes, particularly due to what we were talking about before, is that you do see some hypertrophy due to the blood pressure that you need to overcome when you're resistance training. So probably one of the biggest changes, adaptations that occurs with endurance training is what happens to stroke volume. And stroke volume increases after you endurance train. It increases at all conditions. So resting stroke volume increases, submaximal stroke volume increases, and maximal exertion exercise also results in an increase in stroke volume. And you can see in this figure that no matter whether it's a submaximal intensity, you see an increase in stroke volume, or a maximal, well, running speed in this case, but also reflecting maximal intensity, that you see a larger increase in stroke volume. And this table gives us an idea of what the increases in stroke volume would look like both at rest and at maximal exercise. So you've got untrained subjects on the first line at rest, and we've got a range here, and the range is due to differences in body size. So somebody that's larger is going to have a larger amount of blood volume and a larger amount of stroke volume. If you take a look at untrained versus trained, you'll see that even in a mildly trained state, there's increases in stroke volume when you go from untrained to trained. and it's about a 26% increase if you run the numbers. Um, then if you go from trained to highly trained, you see also an increase in stroke volume. And the difference between trained and highly trained is about 32%. And then if you compare untrained to highly trained, there's about a 50% increase in stroke volume that you see with highly trained individuals. All right, so now we'll go to the second point, and why do we see this increase in stroke volume? I think we've talked about this before, but it's an important concept. What you see is an increase in plasma volume. The plasma volume expands with training. The result is that you have more blood entering the ventricles, and the left ventricle in particular. That results in increase in diastolic volume. And then when the ventricles contract, you have an increase in preload. You have an increase basically in the amount of blood that is being pumped out. And you may recognize this as the Frank-Starling mechanism. Going down to the next point, I think we've mentioned this also, but as you increase in training, resting and submaximal heart rate decreases. And this has a beneficial effect on stroke volume, because what happens is, since your heart isn't contracting as often, it gives you a greater amount of time to fill up the ventricles with blood. And this results in end diastolic volume, and then eventually an increase in stroke volume. Okay, so moving on to the fourth point, you have an increase in left ventricular mass with training. We already talked about this as well. This causes something else to happen that's independent of the increase in plasma volume. So you have an increase in left ventricular mass, and the result of this is that because you have a greater amount of muscle mass, you can contract with more force. If you contract with more force, you're also able to eject more blood out of the ventricles. So again, it's something that happens that's independent of the changes with plasma volume. And if you look at the fifth point there under stroke volume increases after training, it almost is the perfect storm of physiological adaptations happening. So we've talked about what happens on the front end, how you have an increase in plasma volume, a greater ability to accept that blood. You have an increase in muscle mass. And then on the back end, you have basically a decrease amount of resistance that you're trying to pump that blood through. And this is reflected as an increase in total, So what happens is that you have less total peripheral resistance to push against. So it makes it easier to push the blood out to the body. And this is called afterload. So there's a decrease in afterload. Alright, so I decided to make a whole new slide on the last point. And this point is that your stroke volume adaptations to training decrease with age. And there was a study that was done. They took 5 men and they tested them at age 20. And when they were 20 years old, they put them on 20 days of bed rest to try to get them into a deconditioned or a sedentary state. And then after that 20 days, what they did is they then put them through 60 days of training. And in your ultimate long-term longitudinal study, what they did is they took these 5 men and they brought them back when they were 50 years old. So it's not your typical master's thesis, because most of you probably want to graduate on time. But if you didn't mind hanging around for 30 years, you could also employ this study design. Anyway, they brought back these men when they were 50 years old. And what they did was, these men were in basically a sedentary condition at this point, and they then put them on a 6-month training program. And you can take a look at the table. Your book says that there were similar increases in VO2 max. So when they're 20 years old, they had an 18% increase. When they're 50 years old, they had a 14% increase. So they were still able to increase VO2 max significantly. They don't give any data on cardiac output max or AVO2 difference, but they do say that they increased somewhat similarly. And there are really no changes between what happened at 20 years old versus 50 years old. But what they did see is that the increase in stroke volume was much less when they were 50 years old. Actually, and it's the right number now. I just realized that I typed it in incorrectly. But the increase in stroke volume was only half of what it was at when they were younger. You were only able to increase it half as much as when they were older. And the book explains, so you have a somewhat similar VO2 max. So they were guessing that it was offset by the ability of the tissues to take in oxygen and to actually utilize it. So perhaps when you're older you get better at taking in and utilizing the oxygen that's presented. All right, I want to go back to this slide before we leave stroke volume and talk about the classic stroke volume response. Basically, normally what you see is an increase in stroke volume up to 40 to 60%, and then you see a plateau. And you can see this pretty well with the blue line pre-training. And if you look at the red line post-training, you also see this, an increase in stroke volume up to about 40 to 60%, and then the plateau. With very highly trained individuals, basically what you see is the stroke volume doesn't plateau, it continues to increase. But for the majority of the population, what we're going to see is this normal stroke volume response. So we're going to move on, and we're going to talk about heart rate and the heart rate response to aerobic training. And let's take a look at resting heart rate first. And again, this is something that you probably already know. We've mentioned this previously in this lecture. But resting heart rate decreases significantly with training. And it's about 1 beat per minute decrease per week of training. And it lasts for at least the first couple of weeks. I think your textbook makes a reference to about 10 weeks of training. And you can expect it if you started at an initial heart rate of 80, then after 10 weeks your resting heart rate should be around 70. Obviously this slows down the more trained you get. You never get down to a heart rate of 0. But I already talked about my student at Southern Arkansas that he had a resting heart rate around 30. So it does get down pretty low. There isn't a well-defined or well-known mechanism for this. It's thought that what's happening is that you have an increase in parasympathetic action or parasympathetic tone or parasympathetic influence, and this is your kind of housekeeping part of the nervous system, and due to this you have a withdrawal of the sympathetic activity on the heart, and by withdrawing sympathetic nervous system activity, basically you then decrease the amount of beats per minute with heart rate at rest. So let's talk about what happens with the submaximal heart rate response. Basically what happens is you have a lower heart rate for the same given absolute intensity. And we have this figure to help illustrate the point. So for the same absolute intensity, so say we pick 5 kilometers an hour, you can see that post-training, so the red line is lower compared to the blue line, which was before they started their endurance training program. And for each absolute intensity, it's going to be lower. And it is more noticeable. There's a greater difference at your so-called higher submaximal intensities. So if we go back here to this figure, you can see the gap widening with post-training at your higher running speeds. So if we move on to what happens with maximal heart rate, basically, and in theory, you're not supposed to see any difference with training because your max is your max. It's your ceiling no matter what training state you're in. And this holds true. You don't see any significant change in maximal heart rate with endurance training. However, you do see a gradual decrease in maximal heart rate with age, and you all probably pretty well know this. So we've talked about adaptations to stroke volume, we've talked about adaptations with heart rate. Something we need to do real quick here is also talk about heart rate and stroke volume interactions. And it's really a chicken or the egg type of question. You can see there, does a decrease in heart rate result in an increase in stroke volume? Or does the increase in stroke volume result in a decrease in heart rate? And to be honest, it doesn't really matter. What happens is that you optimize both the heart rate response and the stroke volume response, and really they have the same goal, and that goal is to pump a maximal amount of oxygenated blood at the lowest energy cost. So we're going to move on and we're going to talk about heart rate recovery. And I'm going to put up this picture for you. Basically this shows you, and you all know this, if you start at a resting condition, your heart rate is pretty low. If you then go out and you exercise, your heart rate increases. And what we're interested in is what this recovery period looks like in a trained versus an untrained state. Here's the text that goes along with it, and basically you have a faster recovery of heart rate after you have trained. And the example picture that goes along with it is here. You can see there the blue line is before training. You have a fairly good decrease in heart rate, but after endurance training, a period of chronic endurance training, the heart rate recovers much quicker. And because of this, a lot of people have utilized it as an indirect measurement or an indirect indication of somebody's cardiorespiratory fitness. In general, people that are better trained have a quicker recovery heart rate. And there are a few step tests that are submaximal in nature. You'll step up for usually about 3 minutes or 5 minutes, and then what you do is you track recovery heart rate, and you can use that to estimate somebody's VO2 max based on that recovery heart rate. It should be noted that there are other factors that account for or contribute to the recovery heart rate rather than just fitness. So we have to use this as a general tool. It's probably better to track an individual and their recovery heart rate rather than comparing recovery heart rates between individuals. So let's talk about cardiac output real quick. You know that cardiac output is the product of heart rate and stroke volume. And what you see with training is an increase in stroke volume and a decrease in heart rate. So what happens is that at rest you have essentially reciprocal changes. At rest and submaximal exercise. So the increase in stroke volume is offset by the decrease in heart rate. And that's displayed in this figure where it gives you cardiac output at different treadmill speeds, and anywhere from 5 kilometers per hour up to pretty close to 15 kilometers per hour, there's no change. You can see there's no change between an untrained or sedentary individual versus an endurance-trained individual. However, once we get into maximal exertion exercise, cardiac output does increase significantly. And knowing what you know about the heart rate response, maximal heart rate doesn't change. So because you have the equation of cardiac output is equal to heart rate times stroke volume, if maximal heart rate doesn't change, then any increases that you see in cardiac output have to be due to increases in stroke volume at a maximal level. And you can see that here in this figure, the difference between maximal level at pre-training versus maximal level at, after the exercise endurance exercise program. Okay, so we're going to move on. We're going to continue talking about aerobic training, and so far we've been talking more about the cardio changes. Now we're going to get into the vascular changes. So one of the things that happens as a result of endurance training is that there's a greater requirement of blood flow to the active muscle. More active muscles need more oxygen, they need more fuel. So to get the greater blood flow there, one of the things that happens is that you increase the amount of capillarization, or increase just the number of capillaries that are available. And this is a table that your textbook uses to drive home that point. You can look at, I'd probably say first, look at the second column in where it says capillaries per millimeter squared. And let's take a look at the well-trained individual in a pre-exercise condition. You can see that they have 640 capillaries per millimeter squared. And then you compare that to an untrained person in a pre-exercise condition, and you can see that they have significantly more. The other thing that you can do is if you look over at the fourth column where it says capillary to fiber ratio, that's capillary to muscle fibers, and you look at the ratio, so for each muscle fiber there are a lot more capillaries providing vasculature compared to an untrained state. In addition to increasing the total number of capillaries that you have, another thing that happens with training is you have a better ability to utilize the capillaries that you already have. So we're going to call this increased capillary recruitment. And basically what happens here is that the existing capillaries, they have a increased, enhanced ability to open up. And as the diameter increases, that helps out the ability to get blood flow to the working tissue. So the combination of an increased number of capillaries as well as an increased capillary recruitment results in an increase in the total cross-sectional area that's available for capillary exchange. So the net result is an increased ability to exchange oxygen and get nutrients to the working tissue. So I want to go back to this table really quick and point out a couple of things. If you're looking at the capillary to fiber ratio between untrained versus well-trained, you have basically a 50% higher capillary to fiber ratio after training. The other thing is the absolute number of capillaries also increases, and it can increase up to 15% compared to an untrained state. Okay, so moving on, in addition to the increased blood flow due to the increased number of capillaries and better capillary recruitment, we also get better at shunting blood away from tissues that are not active during exercise. So theoretically, we are more efficient not sending blood to inactive areas, and we can send more of that oxygenated and blood that has nutrients to the working muscle. There is a caveat here. This has been shown in an animal model, but it hasn't been replicated to date in a human model. So in theory, this is what should happen. So one of the questions that you might have, and this is addressed in the last point there, is if I increase my total number of capillaries by 15%, or if I increase capillary recruitment so they can open up to a wider diameter, and all the blood goes there, does it affect my ability to then carry out venous return? If all of the blood, or a good portion, is attributed or goes to the capillaries, will that affect the blood returning to the heart? And the answer is no, because I have an increase in total blood volume. The increase in blood volume offsets the blood that is being dedicated and going into the capillaries. So we're going to move on and talk about blood pressure briefly. I think there's a whole 2 paragraphs dedicated to your in your textbook about this, so we'll go ahead and talk about this. And we should probably start off with resting blood pressure, and it's not here, so give me a second. Oh, okay, so I typed it in here for you so you can write it down in your notes. At rest, there's no change in blood pressure in healthy individuals. However, if you have somebody that has borderline hypertension or even moderate hypertension, it'll decrease, and the decrease is about 6 to 7 millimeters of mercury, and it's not known why you see this decrease. However, it's a beneficial thing, so we like to tell people to exercise because it'll improve your blood pressure. The other thing that's not in your textbook, at least I can't see where it is, if you have somebody that has stage 2 hypertension, or really high resting blood pressure values, exercise isn't going to do the trick, or exercise alone won't. If you look at somebody before an exercise program and then after an exercise program, and you have them do the same absolute submaximal workload, what you're going to find is that the blood pressure after the endurance training program will be lower compared to where it was for the same exercise intensity prior to the program. And then with endurance training, if you look at maximal intensity, what you're going to see with blood pressure is an increase in the systolic blood pressure. So it's an increase in that driving force to get oxygenated blood with nutrients to the working tissue. So it's one of the beneficial adaptations that occurs is an increase in maximal systolic blood pressure. And then on the flip side, in order to accommodate filling time and other issues that we've previously talked about, what you're going to see is a decrease in diastolic blood pressure with maximal intensity exercise. So we're going to move on and we're going to talk about what happens with blood volume. And leading into this, I want you to be aware that blood volume is made up of 2 components. You've got a liquid portion, or plasma volume, and then you've got a packed cell, or I guess solid component that are made up of red blood cells. So your total blood volume increases and the increase occurs pretty quickly with exercise. And first we'll talk about the liquid portion. So you do see an increase in plasma volume immediately after an acute bout of exercise. And you'll see this within the first hour after a bout. And essentially what happens is that you increase the plasma proteins that are in your bloodstream. And the protein that is mainly responsible is plasma albumin. So you'll upregulate this protein in the blood after an exercise bout, and it has an oncotic effect, or you basically, because you have proteins in the blood, it causes the plasma, or the liquid portion, to shift and to remain in the bloodstream. Another thing that happens is that you have certain hormones that are activated. You have antidiuretic hormone and you have aldosterone, and both of these have effects to retain this liquid portion. So the effect is water reabsorption and as well as sodium retention. And you can see there this all takes place within the first 2 weeks of initiating an endurance training program. So moving off of the liquid portion, next thing we're going to talk about is the more solid components. And what you see is an increase in red blood cell volume, although you might see a decrease in hematocrit. And we'll go to this picture to explain what's going on. You can see pre-training, you've got a certain volume of red blood cells. Post-training, you see it go up a little bit. Hematocrit is the ratio of plasma, or the liquid component, to the cell component. And because you see such a large increase in the liquid component, or the plasma volume, actually when you take the ratio to the red blood cells, you have a decrease in percent of hematocrit. And this is actually a benefit because it decreases the overall viscosity of your blood. And it has the net effect of making the blood a little bit thinner, and it makes it easier for the blood to flow through the vessels, especially your smaller vessels such as your capillaries, which are leading to the tissues that are active. So there's a more efficient delivery of oxygenated and nutrient blood to the tissues. Okay, so this is your one slide that you get on the respiratory adaptations with endurance or aerobic training. I should mention that even though there's only one slide dedicated to this, if you didn't have the respiratory system, then none of the adaptations that we saw with the cardiovascular system would make any sense or would make any matter, because you couldn't actually get oxygen into the cardiovascular system. So despite this little bit that we're going to talk about it is very important. So let's talk about pulmonary ventilation, just the volume that you're moving in and out of the lungs. At rest, it doesn't change from an untrained to a trained state. At any given submaximal intensity, again, looking at that same intensity in a trained versus an untrained state, what you're going to see is a decrease after training. And it can decrease by as much as 20 to 30%. And probably at first you're thinking, yeah, that doesn't make any sense, it should be better. But it's going to make more sense once we talk about pulmonary diffusion. So actual ventilation, the volume that we're moving in and out, it decreases with submaximal intensity. However, at maximal intensity, you do see an increase in pulmonary ventilation. And this is due to two factors. First is that you increase your tidal volume at maximal intensity exercise. And secondly, as any of you who have ever done a VO2 max test know, your respiratory frequency or your breathing is much greater at maximal intensity. So combined increased tidal volume and increased number of breaths result in an increase in pulmonary ventilation at maximal exercise. Okay, so let's move on and talk about pulmonary diffusion. And this is the actual gas exchange in the alveoli. And it's noted there that pulmonary diffusion is unchanged during the resting condition and also during submaximal intensity. But I have to think that it's a little more efficient at submaximal intensity, which accounts for why pulmonary ventilation can decrease with submaximal exercise. With maximal intensity exercise, you have an increase in pulmonary diffusion, and basically it's due to the increase in volume of blood that is running through those pulmonary veins, which return oxygenated blood to the lungs. And your book notes that there's a greater amount of blood flow, particularly to the upper regions of the lungs. So as the air is coming directly into the lungs, into those upper regions, it can be better perfused, it can pick up the oxygen, and you have a greater ability for the alveoli to carry out gas exchange. So let's talk about the AVO2 difference. And this is measured as the milliliters of oxygen per 100 milliliters of blood. And basically we'll look at the arterial side of the vascular system, and we look at the venous side of the vascular system, and we subtract what's there. And you have an increased AVO2 difference after endurance training or after aerobic training compared to the sedentary state. And that's because you can take out more blood, because more oxygen actually, because active tissue requires it to produce energy.